The Media Institute, the foremost independent advocate for the First Amendment for over 4 decades, is one of the nation's leading nonpartisan organizations focused on media and communications policy. The Media Institute promotes freedom of speech, recognizes excellence in journalism, and encourages a competitive media environment and communications industry. Considering the current state of affairs in the nation's capital and across the country, our mission has never been more relevant. And now the President and CEO of the Media Institute, Rick Kapler.
Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to our September virtual Communications Forum Luncheon. It's great to have you with us today. I'd like to start by thanking our luncheon sponsors who make this series possible. We couldn't do this without you, and our special thanks to John Taylor of LG Electronics and to our producer, Dave Arland of Arland Communications. Our next virtual luncheon will take place in late October, and we'll have those details for you soon. But first, let me say a word about what's coming up on the evening of October 14th. That's the date of the Media Institute's Free Speech America Gala. This year, for the first time ever, it will be in a virtual format. The theme for the gala is A Voice for Everyone, and we're going to recognize 2 individuals who have worked hard to promote diversity and bring broadband and telecom services to all Americans. We'll present our American Horizon Award to David Cohen, Senior Executive Vice President of Comcast. And we'll present our Freedom of Speech Award to former FCC Commissioner and Acting Chair Mignon Clyburn. Our featured speaker will be FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. The Free Speech America Gala is our principal fundraising event. Even though we're virtual this year, we still need your support. In fact, we need your sponsorship more than ever. We've put together a great package of benefits for our sponsors, including a gourmet dinner from Occasions Caterers, delivered to your home with wine and flowers on the evening of October 14th. You can learn more about our gala and sign up as a sponsor by going to our website, mediainstitute.org. We need your support, so plan to join us. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Charlie Cook is the well-known editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report and political analyst for the National Journal Group. He's also a political analyst for NBC News. Charlie founded the independent and nonpartisan Cook Political Report in 1984. Now, with a staff of 6, it's an authoritative resource that Bob Schieffer of CBS News has called the Bible of the political community. Al Hunt of the Wall Street Journal has referred to Charlie as the Picasso of election analysts. Charlie has appeared on ABC World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, ABC's This Week, and over a dozen times on NBC's Meet the Press. He's also served as an election night analyst for CBS, CNN, and NBC. In 2010, Charlie was the co-recipient of the American Political Science Association's prestigious Carey McWilliams Award. And in 2013, Charlie served as a resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. With only 6 weeks until Election Day, we're eager to hear how Charlie is sizing up the big races, including the big race. Remember that during Charlie's talk, you'll have a chance to submit your questions by using the Ask a Question feature on your screen. After Charlie's talk, our chairman of the board, Dick Wiley, is going to have a lively Q&A session with Charlie based on your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce one of this country's most distinguished political analysts, Mr. Charlie Cook.
Wow, Rick, thank you. I wish my parents were still around to hear that introduction, but thank you all. It's an honor to be with all of you today, even if it's just virtually. And when Dick Wiley asked me to do this, I was more than happy to. You found the right guy to do the ask. But anyway, but thank you all for everything you do to try to help facilitate a nation that isn't always receptive to curated information and quality news and quality programming, and whether it's electronic or print or anything else. Thank you all very much for what you're doing. What I thought I would do is just quickly capsule where the race seems to be right now, and then back up and sort of kind of put it into a context of what I think is happening out there right now. That President Trump is call it 7, 8, 9, 10 points somewhere behind Joe Biden. It had been in the 4, 5, 6 range. Pretty much, generally speaking, pretty much from the time Biden got in the race in April 25th of last year, all the way through the end of May of this year. And then you started seeing a little widening out to the point where it was, call it 8 to 10 consistently going into the two conventions. And now I would sort of widen it out to 7 to 10. But the difference between 4 to 6 and 7 to 10, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot, because it's the difference between where the race was competitive. Biden was consistently ahead, but the president was within striking distance, if you will. And we're at that point, Biden was ahead in, call it 3, 4 of the key 6 battleground states, and was basically even in the other 2 or 3, but where Biden had an advantage, but it was still iffy and somewhat iffy. And then now we're, the president's basically behind in all 6 of the battleground states, but some states, North Carolina and Florida, less than Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. But where, people say, well, whether there's 43 days to go before the election. Well, actually not. I mean, because voting really basically started week before last, when the first mail ballots were sent out by North Carolina. And as you know, and those of you who live in Virginia know that, voting has already started. Early in-person voting started 4 or 5 days ago, or started late last week. So, and that no elected incumbent president has ever come back from being this far down, this short before the election. And then with so many people voting so early, where we're expecting a big chunk of people voting before the first debate a week from tomorrow night, before the end of September, so that an October surprise really needs to be in September, and preferably, next week or something, if it were really going to try to shake this race up. And so I think the president's in a really uphill situation. I wouldn't say, it's not a done deal. I wouldn't say he can't close the gap back, but as I'll talk in a few minutes, his numbers haven't really been terribly volatile. They haven't moved up much at all, and that he doesn't show a resiliency that I think a very disciplined, focused incumbent president in this kind of jam would, I think, have a better chance of coming back than the president does. But it could happen. In the U.S. Senate, it's going to be a close call. That you could easily see 50, 100,000 votes in 2 or 3 states that would make the difference in control. I would put the odds of Democrats winning a majority somewhere above 50-50, but probably not to 60-40, or somewhere between 50-50 and 60-40. But there are a lot of really close races, with only about 3 that I think you could say are kind of done now, and a bunch more that are sort of close to the edge. The House of Representatives is kind of it's a done deal. That there's no realistic chance for Republicans to get a majority back at this point. And to be honest, it's probably, I'd say the odds are slightly better that Democrats will have a net gain of seats than a net loss of seats in the House of Representatives, which, when you consider it's coming on the heels of a 40-seat gain, where it would be perfectly normal for a party, after winning 40 seats in the House, to lose 5 or 10 or 15 in the next election, and that doesn't look terribly likely to happen. So let's talk about what's going on and why. It's often said that generals fight the last war. Well, I think that happens a lot in politics, where people tend to wage the last campaign. And there's sometimes people have this assumption that the context, the circumstances, the people, the issues are going to be the same as in the previous election, which is just rarely the case. And where, it depends, depending upon which side you're on. One side is bringing a lot of baggage, of political baggage from 2016 into this campaign, mental baggage, and that Democrats are still suffering from PTSD to the point from their surprising loss, and from sort of what they see as the consequences of that loss, that there's a bit of I think over caution there. And on the Republican side, I think we're seeing a willingness to sort of bask in a little bit of the memory and glory of the stunning upset from 4 years ago, and praying or pretending that the circumstances are the same when they really aren't. And I think that for people in sort of my space, in the journalism space that many of you are in, that there's an over caution because of 2016 being such a surprise, that for a lot of people, rather than trying to figure out what did happen in 2016 and why did it happen, and does it resemble this time, yes or no, they're just frozen in caution. So, to borrow Alan Greenspan's irrational exuberance, I think we're seeing an irrational degree of caution when the data argues pretty strongly that the president's got a real uphill fight here. And I think there are only like three things where 2020 and 2016 are alike. They're both U.S. presidential elections. Donald Trump is the Republican nominee in both of them, and both years start in a 2. But other than that, there's just really not much of a resemblance whatsoever. And the biggest difference, but there are many, but the biggest difference is that when you have a presidential election with no incumbent running, and whether it's George W. Bush, Al Gore in 2000, or John McCain, Barack Obama in 2008, or Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton in 2016, it's a choice. People are asked to choose between two candidates. And partisanship comes in. I'll talk about that in just a second, but fundamentally it's a choice. But when an incumbent is running for re-election, this is a referendum. Overwhelmingly, it's a referendum. It's a thumbs up or thumbs down decision regarding that incumbent. Do you want to renew a president's contract for another 4 years? Yes or no. It's a vote of yes, I have confidence. No, I don't have confidence. And of course, anytime you have an incumbent that's in, a challenging race, and whether it's President Trump right now, or, even I'd say Barack Obama in 2012, when the economy had not, it was getting better than it was in 2008, but not that much better, not that quickly. And where his reelection was hardly a done deal in the early and middle stages of the campaign. But when any incumbent is endangered, yes, it's a referendum up or down on them for the most part. But what an incumbent tries to do is to either disqualify the opponent, in the sense of trying to politically disfigure that opponent to the point that they become so politically unpalatable, an unacceptable alternative, a risky choice, or they try to change the subject of the election, get the election to be about anything else but a referendum up or down in the last 4 years, or both. Now, I did do the carve out for partisanship because I do think that's awfully important. And to think about, and things are just so much more partisan today than they were. But I think, one way to frame it is this. You've got about 30% of the electorate consider themselves Republicans, and 90% of the time they can be counted upon to vote Republican, 90% of the time. So that's 30%. And another roughly 30% call themselves Democrats, and they vote Democratic come hell or high water 90% of the time. And that leaves a 40% in the middle. But I think what a lot of people don't appreciate about that 40% is the vast majority of them really aren't very independent. that if a pollster pushes them at all and say, well, would you say you lean to the Republican side or do you lean to the Democratic side? The vast majority of them will confess that they lean one way or the other. And of the independents who say they lean Republican, 80% of them can vote down the line Republican, just as 80% of the independents who lean Democrat go Democratic down the line. And so that really only leaves, depending upon the pollster, between 5 or 6 and 11, 12, 13% of the electorate that is truly, purely independent, that really are up for grabs. But the thing that's there, and while there are some very bright people who think about issues a lot and contemplate them carefully and are conflicted on issues that are in this group, there may be 10 of them in the whole country, 20 maybe. But the vast majority of the people that are in this pure independent and typically up for grabs in so many races, they're low information voters. They don't watch news. They don't listen to news. They don't read news. If they had any desire to follow these things, they would probably become known as either Republicans or Democrats. They would probably be either liberals or conservatives, or at least they would have thought through being moderates. But the thing is, most of these people are just sort of out there, and a lot of them don't end up voting at all. So, but partisanship plays a huge role. But among the people in the middle, that group, it's a referendum up or down on the incumbent. Now, other differences from 2016, then we'll kind of get into the handicapping here. 2016, I think probably one unappreciated thing, a thing that we kind of intellectually knew but didn't fully recognize or take into consideration, is that Democrats had the White House for 8 consecutive years. And that means that they were the status quo party. And we knew intellectually that of the 6 times since the end of World War II that a party had the White House for 8 consecutive years, 5 times out of 6, that party lost the presidential race. And somehow, for some reason, we discounted that, and we shouldn't. So now put it in the back of your mind for next time that's the case, it'll be 6 out of 7. But that Hillary Clinton represented continuity and Donald Trump represented change in that configuration. And the second difference, obviously, as I mentioned a minute ago, was that this is a referendum up or down on President Trump. He has a record, he has 4 years to defend, and that's just a real different situation, a different dynamic than 2016. The third thing is that Hillary Clinton is not, that Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. And that there's not much of a comparison there in the sense that the 2016 election was a contest between the Republican with the highest unfavorable ratings in the history of polling, which basically means the post-World War II era, up against the Democrat with the highest unfavorable ratings of any Democratic nominee in the history of polling. And that one of them was going to win no matter what. But you're talking about 2 deeply, deeply polarizing people, and that Hillary Clinton had sort of accumulated political baggage since she and her husband came on the scene back in 1991, 92, when he was running for president. And that while Bill Clinton, at least until the Me Too movement came along, with some people, it seemed like he was almost, had a Teflon coating, that stuff just didn't stick to him. But for Hillary Clinton, it was more like Velcro, that things just stuck to her in a way that didn't stick to a lot of other people. And so when you looked at the polling back in 2016, favorable, unfavorables, both Clinton and Trump both always had double-digit net unfavorables. In other words, their unfavorable ratings were higher than their favorable ratings by double digits, and usually mid to high double digits. Contrast that with Joe Biden now, where, if you averaged a whole bunch of polls, it'd probably be a wash, or he'd be somewhere between net +5 and net down 5. But that's a long way from net double digits and net mid to high double digits. That's a very different situation, not the polarizing force that you would think. So Fourth is that I think the Biden campaign, they will make mistakes. They will make all new mistakes. They probably won't make the same mistakes though that the Clinton campaign did. I can pretty much guarantee they're not going to be complacent and ignore Michigan and Wisconsin. And they're not going to ignore the part in the state that's between the Philly metro and the Pittsburgh metro, the T, the middle and across the top, which the Clinton campaign just assumed and thought that they could win enough votes in the Philly metro and the Pittsburgh metro that they wouldn't need to, they didn't need to get much, if anything, in the middle and across the top. Well, it turned out they did, because you had of the 67 counties in the state of Pennsylvania, a dozen of them gave Trump 70% of the vote or more, and 3 of them gave him 80% of the vote. And the turnout was at unprecedented levels. So in an election that was otherwise basically an average turnout election, so that it completely sort of blew the models. But she was going for the big win and not nailing down the state she needed to guarantee 270 electoral votes. The other thing, kind of piece of baggage that people are bringing in before I jump into 2020 fully, is this feeling of, well, the polls were all wrong, and so we should not listen to the polls at all because they were all wrong. And basically, that's a fundamental misreading of what happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton won the national popular vote by a 2.1 percentage point margin, 2.9 million votes. What do national polls purport to measure? The national popular vote. No national poll tries to say what's going to happen in any one state. It's national. And the Real Clear Politics average of all the major national polls showed Clinton with a 3.2 percentage point lead going into Election Day, 3.2, and she won the national popular vote by 2.1 percentage points. So they were off by 1.1 percentage points. Now, the pollsters and political scientists went back after the election to look at it and to say, okay, 1.1, that's not off much, but why was it off there? And to look at why were some of the polls in the states off, that I'm going to get to in just a second. But what they discovered is when they looked at specifically who was interviewed by many of the major national pollsters before the election, and then they ran those by the voter files that the secretaries of state have of who you can't tell how someone voted, but you could tell if they voted. And they found that whites with less than a 4-year college degree were a little bit underrepresented in the samples, and whites with a 4-year college degree were slightly oversampled. Now, historically, that wouldn't have been a big deal because there weren't that big of differences between how whites with 4-year college degrees and whites without voted. But increasingly in recent years, it is becoming a big difference, and President Trump even more so. Now, Donald Trump won the support of people with bachelor's and master's and PhDs and probably double PhDs. But if you were going to say what was his strongest demographic group, and you would say whites with less than a 4-year college degree, and that he had a level of resistance among college-educated whites, much more than Republicans normally have, and white college-educated suburban women, much more, many of whom had sort of a visceral reaction to President Trump or to candidate Donald Trump. And that threw the poll off by 1.1 percentage points. And when pollsters went back afterwards to say, after that, they found this, they started correcting for it, waiting for it in the 2018 midterm election, and since, and worked completely fine. So that's where the variation was. Now, I understand that winning the national popular vote and $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks. I get that. It's absolutely true. But the thing is, 45 states, the Cook Political Report, and we're looking at all kinds of public polling, private polling that we're given access to, talking to campaign consultants and everything else, both sides. going into election day, we had 45 states rated as lean, likely, solid Republican or lean, likely, solid Democrat, that all 45 of those went exactly the way we thought. And where the state polling was absolutely fine in 45 states. The polling was telling us that 2 states were really close that we put as toss-ups, Florida and North Carolina. Well, guess what? They were really close. I mean, Florida, Obama had won it by a point in 2012. President Trump ended up winning it by 1 point in 2016. The Senate race and the governor's race in 2018 went Republican by 1 percentage point. Hey, they were really close. Where there was a poll off, and a serious poll off, was in 3 states: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And that's where there were, now, 2 of those 3, as I mentioned earlier, Michigan and Pennsylvania, weren't even targeted. You know, Michigan and Wisconsin, Michigan and Wisconsin had each gone Democratic in 6 consecutive presidential elections. The last Democrat to lose in either one was Michael Dukakis in 1988. The last Democrat to lose Pennsylvania was Walter Mondale. I'm sorry, Pennsylvania, Michigan. The last Democrat to lose Wisconsin was Walter Mondale in 1984. He had gone Democratic 7 times in a row. Now, Pennsylvania was hard fought, as I said, where the Clinton campaign spent a lot of money in the East, a lot of money in the West, and nothing in between. But for the other 2, took it for granted. In fact, Hillary Clinton never stepped foot in the state of Wisconsin between Labor Day and Election Day. And nothing was done to get the urban vote out in Detroit and Milwaukee. Nothing was done to get the kids out in Madison and Lansing and Ann Arbor. I mean, that there was just practically no Democratic campaign there whatsoever. So the Biden campaign is not going to be running, is not going to make at least the same mistakes that Clinton's campaign did. Now, but the polling, though, was off in those 3, and we think that it's been fixed and feel pretty good about it. And this business about shy Trump voter, I don't know any professionals that actually believe in that theory, that if you studied it closely, you'd see that it really was about the undersampling of non-college whites. It wasn't about people lying to the pollsters. And in fact, some political scientists have looked at this and found that you had the disparity between what polls showed and what really happened was even there in states where Trump was very, very, very popular. In North Dakota or Idaho, there was no stigma against supporting Donald Trump. Why would they want to lie to pollsters, in a place where virtually all their neighbors were voting for Donald Trump? So it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. But we think the polling is fixed. Okay, now the best way. I said that for an incumbent president's reelection, it's a referendum up or down, and the best predictor of whether a president's going to get reelected or not is very simply the job approval rating. And if you look at the Gallup poll over the years, and it's into World War II, basically every president that went into election day with a job approval rating over 50%, every one of them won. And every one of them that had a job approval rating under 48%, every one of them lost. And there was only one, that would be Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. If you're talking elected presidents, you could throw in Ford too, although he had been unelected. But all 3 of those had job approval ratings under that 48% level. The one that was in that zone in between 48 to 50 was George W. Bush. He was at 48%. And that going into the election, and some of you may remember Election Day 2004 was kind of an interesting day, where there were lots of people, it was very close, and lots of people thought John Kerry was winning that race, where it really was a close race, but where there seems to be a line there. So where is President Trump? Well, again, for historic data, we always use Gallup because they're the only ones that go back to the war. But in his first year in office, President Trump's Gallup job approval rating for the entire year was 38%. 38%. That was the lowest of any any elected incumbent president in post-World War II history. If you're curious, that 38%, well, who was the second lowest? The second lowest was Bill Clinton for a first year, and he was at 49 points, 11 points higher than Trump's 38 for his first year job approval. Now that's 38% first year. Okay, for his second year in office, it went up 2 points from 38 to 40. And that was the lowest second year of any elected president in post-World War II history. Then we go into the third year, effectively 2019. Now, his number approval over the year went up another 2 points to 42%. And now it was no longer the lowest third year of any elected president post-World War II history, because Jimmy Carter had slid in under him at 37. So he was second, he's second from the lowest. But the thing is 42 for the entire presidency in Gallup, he's averaged 40%. Now, if you might be able to skimp through at 48 and you'd like to have over 50, you've averaged 40% for your entire presidency, and you've never hit more than 49% in a single major national poll. You've never exceeded 49% in a Gallup poll. You've never exceeded 48% in a Fox News poll. You've never been over 38 in a NBC Wall Street Journal, or 35 in a CNN poll, or 35 in the PBS NPR Marist, or 36 in the ABC Washington Post poll. If those are the best approval ratings you've hit, then how can someone look at that person and say they are a front runner to get reelected? You just sort of simply can't do that. Now, so where are we now? As I said earlier, the president was behind by 4 to 6 points up through the end of May. And then his job approval rating kind of fluttered in April, but didn't really decline. His job approval started sliding some in April. And then in June was when you started seeing the gap between Joe Biden and President Trump start to widen. And what you saw primarily was there were some independents that were voting for Donald Trump that were moved over into undecided. And then there were some independents that were already in undecided that were moving over towards Biden. But there was a tiny little bit of leakage among Republicans that snapped back after the Republican convention. But so 4 to 6, then it went to 8 to 10 coming out of the convention, and now it's somewhere between 7 and 10 points. And there was one point that I just thought about, I should have mentioned. Well, the heck with it. Let's keep moving because I need to speed up here. So right now, he's behind by 4 points or more in 4 of the 6 key battleground states, in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, as well as Arizona. Basically sort of even to slightly ahead in the other 2. That would be Florida and North Carolina. And then he's got 4 more states. Again, all of these are states that Trump carried. That Trump carried last time: Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, Texas, where he's basically running even, give or take 2 points. Maybe ahead. Maybe if you did 10 polls, Trump would probably be ahead in 4 or 5 and behind in 3 or 4 and tied in 1 or 2. But in Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, and Texas, now, can things change? Yes, it can. But when people say 43 days left before the election, no, there's not really. People started voting in North Carolina. The first ballots went out a week before last. The in-person voting, as I said, started in Virginia last week. And that we are expecting, polls are showing a likelihood that we're going to have more early voting than ever before, and a whole lot more people voting either early in person or voting by mail, not only than ever before, but a heck of a lot more than on election day. So that every day that goes by, the pool of available votes for President Trump to narrow the gap, to close the gap, just get smaller and smaller and smaller. So what happened to cause this switch from 4 to 6 to now 7 to 10? And I think it was two different things, and obviously related to the coronavirus and the economy. But let's do the economy first. Normally speaking, if you had an incumbent up for reelection, and particularly one that didn't have particularly good job approval ratings, if you had an incumbent up for reelection and they and you didn't even know who it was, just it was an incumbent president running for election, and their job approval ratings hadn't been very good, and somebody told you we're going to have a severe economic downturn in the election year before the election, it would be a reasonably safe assumption to say, well, that incumbent's toast. Well, that's not exactly what happened, because while normally you might expect that incumbent to encounter a headwind if they started going down into a recession, that's not what happened. Everybody knows the recession was caused by the coronavirus. There's no way President Trump could stop the coronavirus from coming into this country. There was no way he could have stopped an economic downturn. That's not it. But the economy, the strong economy, was the most compelling argument that Donald Trump had for reelection. It was his strong, it was the one, if you tested job approval rating on all these things, it was the one that was always the highest with the lowest disapproval rating. And early on, if you ask who would be better handling the economy, that Trump would be way ahead of Biden on it. But what we've seen is it's the loss. It's not the headwind that he's encountered. It's the loss of a tailwind, the wind that was at his back that was keeping him from falling farther behind, that he lost that tailwind. So that he lost the most compelling reason for people in that swing group, the people that weren't in the 42% Trump base. The biggest reason, best reason for them to vote for him was the economy. And that issue got basically taken off the table. And one other thing about the economy, and that was you had a group of people, these undecideds, these people in the middle, they thought the economy is great, and they gave President Trump 100% of the credit for that strong economy. Absolutely did. But a lot of those same people expressed to pollsters and in regular polls and in focus groups some misgivings, some doubts, some concerns about President Trump as a person, his character, his truthfulness, his leadership style, various things like they were real concerns, but the strong economy kept those concerns in check. And with the loss of that economy, you just saw those concerns starting to come up. And his handling of, the news conferences that the task force had after a week or two, you could start to see his numbers starting to wiggle some, and then they started dropping down. And where, sometimes he can be his own worst enemy, and you saw that come into play, and these doubts, these concerns starting to rise among these people. And then you just simply get to the coronavirus. And look, when you've got roughly 40%, high 40s, 40% approve the job he's done, handling the biggest crisis our country's faced in 3/4 of a century, and generally high 50s to 60% disapproving the job he's done handling the coronavirus, this close to an election, that's a problem. That's just a real problem, particularly when you get 40, oftentimes you'll see 47, 48%, 49, 50, or 47, 48%, not just disapprove of his handling of the economy, but strongly disapprove his handling of the coronavirus. Man, that's just really tough. Real fast. So that, can he turn this around? Yeah, he could. Did he get the coronavirus under control so we can get the economy turning around for a strong third quarter resurrection of the economy? No, that's not happening. Did the conventions give him a bounce? He got a point or two. Is he likely to get it from the debates? I have no reason to believe that President Trump would likely do any better in the debates than Joe Biden will. I mean, number one, they're not debates. I mean, this is not Lincoln Douglas. I mean, basically, they're like Sunday political talk shows, but with both the candidates there. And this year, they're not even having panels of questioners. They've got one questioner in each. For example, Chris Wallace is doing one. Now, the Trump people have their talking point has been Joe Biden is senile. He has dementia. I had one tell me back in March that Biden can hardly string two sentences together. You know, they all but predicted that he'd have drool coming down his chin. Now, I watched him in Iowa, New Hampshire. I never saw that. I think most of us, all of us, watched him in some of the debates. We never saw that. Now, his acceptance speech was on a teleprompter, so yeah, okay. But you know what? I didn't see any signs of dementia I just didn't see it. And the fact is that when he's been interviewed one-on-one, or when he's been interviewed, Biden's done fine this year. I mean, it doesn't step his foot in his mouth any more, probably less than he has through his entire career this year. But you look over at President Trump and you think, I mean, I tell you what, I think it would have been very hard for any Trump supporter to have watched his interview with Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday about 2 months ago and not worry about losing their last meal, because that was horrible. He was awful, and not much better. 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, again in an interview with Jonathan Swan, where he was defensive. When he didn't come across as uninformed, he came across as very defensive or completely out of touch. So that the debates could turn around, could, but I don't know that it would go one direction any more likely than the other. So I would put the odds, to be honest, at a 20% chance that President Trump wins the Electoral College, 40% chance that it's a skinny Biden win, and a 40% chance that it's a big Biden win. Now, the 20% Trump wins the Electoral College, to be honest, I don't think it's actually 20. That 20 includes a considerable cover your ass quotient there. But, I'm just going to do 20 just because it's probably not good to go any lower than that. But 40 would be defined as basically Biden winning the three states that Hillary lost by 0.7 of a point or less: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and maybe Arizona, maybe not. A big Biden win would be those four, plus maybe either Florida or North Carolina or both, or maybe getting one or two out of Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, or Texas. That would be a big Biden. But anyway, I think it's done. Now, in 60 seconds or less for the Senate, we can cover it more in the Q&A portion if you'd like. Arizona and Colorado, they're kind of done, to be perfectly honest. And in the case of Cory Gardner in Colorado, look, the state just changed. It's getting less, and it was Republican leaning, swing. It's getting harder and harder and harder. And President Trump's numbers are just awful in the state. Cory Gardner would need a bunch of Biden Gardner voters to win. And I don't think that there's going to be enough for him, but he's been behind for a good while. Martha McSally, I would say the same thing. It hasn't changed quite as much as Colorado has, but it is changing. Plus, she ran so far to the right to try to win her Republican primary in 2018 that she has not been able to get anywhere near towards the center again. So they're both uphill. And then you've got Maine, North Carolina, where it's uphill really for Collins and for Tillis, but not as uphill as the other two, but it's uphill for them. And then in Iowa, Joni Ernst, she's in a real tough race. You saw the Des Moines Register poll has it down 3 that came out 2 days ago. And then David Perdue in Georgia, where that's another state that's truly changing. Lots of people moving in from other parts of the country, just like Arizona and Texas and North Carolina, that moving over. So anyway, and then there are just a bunch of states that are sort of on the cusp, where Kansas is awfully close, open seat. I don't think Democrats are going to win in Texas, but it's closer than you would think. the other Georgia seat. I mean, I think we're going to have probably a good chance we'll have 2 runoffs for the U.S. Senate that would be on January 5th. So if the Senate's really that close, this thing could go into overtime. But I'd put it 60-40, 55-45, 60-40 that the Senate will flip to. So I'll turn it back to Rick and to Dick.
Charlie, thank you very much. That was terrific, and we appreciate you being with us as always. Charlie, we've got a lot of questions. I can't cover them all, but let's start out with the question about the impact of the Supreme Court appointment. What do you think that might be?
You know, there's nothing that energizes a party base like a Supreme Court vacancy, like a Supreme Court fight. But you know why I'm skeptical about whether it'll have that much of an impact? I think both party bases were already at DEFCON 1. I mean, I think both parties' bases were so totally energized that how would you be able to tell? I mean, the Trump Republican side, they were pumped up in 2018 and came out in big numbers, which was enough for them to pick up a pair of Senate seats in red states. But the Democrats were pumped up and came out in enormous numbers, where in purple states in the suburbs, it came out of the woodwork and Democrats picked up 40 seats. That's why we had the highest midterm turnout since 1914. Polling all last year before the coronavirus, showing record high levels of interest in this election. It dipped a little early in the year after the coronavirus hit. Now it's back up where it's now at the highest level it's ever been at this point, and in some polls higher than it's even been a week or a month before the election. And we're seeing, the request for absentee ballots, the lines in Virginia that would be blocks long. So I think both bases are going to be incredibly motivated. So I don't think this is a Kavanaugh where there was some, prior to Kavanaugh in 2018, there was a little lethargy on the part of the Republican base, but Kavanaugh snapped them back up. And by election day, they came out in big numbers. I'm assuming that they're both coming out. And the kinds of people the few people that are left that are undecided about President Trump and undecided in this election, they don't even know what the Supreme Court is. So I don't, with all due respect to all your members and what they do, these aren't your peeps, So I don't think, I think it's enormously important for the country. It's important for the Supreme Court. Democrats will say for Obamacare. For all these things, it's incredibly important, but I don't think it's going to affect this election a bit at all. And I haven't talked to any operatives, and I just got off a call with one of the heads of one of the super PACs who said, hey, nobody knows, but you know what my hunch is? Probably not much, if at all.
Okay. Charlie, here's another question. A recent poll states that President Trump is gaining African-American and Latino support, but losing some white voters. Do you see this kind of shift happening?
African-American, no. No. And Latinos, it a little bit on the Latino side, but it's funny. It's much more in Arizona. Much more in Florida, but not so much in Arizona. But the president is doing somewhat better among Latinos. But number one, if this was an election that was limited entirely to Latinos, then that would obviously be a big deal. But number one, it's not. Number two, it's not a big group in quite a few states. And it is the two lowest voter turnout demographic groups we have are Latinos and young people. And that's one reason, Latinos, in terms of voting age population, Latinos are every bit as big or just passed up African Americans. Did you hear Biden seriously contemplate many Latino running mates? No. And the reason is because they don't, I mean, no Democratic official would ever tell you this, but because they don't vote their proportions, they have a shorter seat at the table. And so that's, but Florida is really the place, but Arizona, where Biden is doing incredibly well, we haven't seen quite so much of that. And I'm actually looking at a crosstab, but nationally it's a little bit, but well, okay, how about this? Biden is overperforming among whites. Okay, which do you want to do better in?
Okay, Charlie, another question, sort of looking out a bit. Do you see the Sun Belt swing states, Texas, Arizona, Georgia, trending blue in the next decade, while the Rust Belt states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and maybe Minnesota, beginning to turn somewhat red?
We're definitely seeing some changes here, and take geography out of it for 1 second. What we're seeing, we started seeing 30, 40, 50 years ago, working class whites, blue collar whites, non-college whites, leaving the Democratic Party and moving towards and into the Republican Party. Led at the front by those that were evangelical, but it's not exclusively there. That's one reason why when people say the Democratic Party is more liberal than it was back when Bill Clinton was president, that's why it's one reason why it's absolutely true, because the least liberal group in the Democratic Party left. And so it moved on. Okay. Then at the same time, or more recently, we've seen white college graduates, particularly suburban, particularly women, moving in the opposite direction. Okay. So we're seeing this happen, demographically. Then we're seeing into some southern states, think Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and throw in Arizona, even though it's kind of not southern. People moving in from other parts of the country, non-Southerners, non-Georgians, non-North Carolinians, non-Texans, moving in and making and changing the voting patterns in those states. Very, very, very much so. But it's not happening in Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, to a lesser extent, South Carolina. It's not happening there. Tennessee, it's not happening so much. So that certain states are trending where high growth and people moving in and a larger of a college educated suburbs moving up. And at the same time, the states that have disproportionately large number of non-college whites as a share of the electorate, that's where Democrats have had some resistance. Those three, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota. First of all, it's been a long time since Hubert Humphrey was around. I mean, it's been a thinner victory margin for Democrats than people like to think in Minnesota. So yeah, you are seeing some. But having said that, do I think that President Trump is going to carry Michigan, Pennsylvania, or Wisconsin? No.
Okay. For this audience, here's a question. How about broadband funding, broadband infrastructure funding, maybe COVID legislation as well? You see those coming up in the election and in the debates.
Okay, this will be an unpopular answer. I don't think many people vote on issues, to be perfectly honest. But I think their positions on issues, their feelings about issues are baked into their partisanship. That certain views you have about the role of government, either activists or not, how interventionist it should be, I think that's baked into the cake on party identification, either Democrat or Republican. So that I don't think there are going to be many issues at all that are going to be. I mean, Donald Trump, politically speaking, he is the sun, and our political system has been the solar system all around it. Everything has revolved around him since he's become president, and nothing has overshadowed that or diminished it for good or ill. Nothing has diminished it. So that when the people were saying, well, Biden's got to pick an African-American because he's got to goose up the African-American turnout. Well, first of all, I didn't see any signs that they needed any motivation, and certainly after George Floyd, they sure as hell didn't. And it wasn't going to make. But the thing about it is, but the other reason that fits into this argument was, I don't know how relevant Joe Biden is going to be to this election. Not much less Kamala Harris or any specific issue. It's do you want to go with and stay with President Trump, or do you want to go a different way? And I don't think any issue, broadband or anything else. Now, do I think infrastructure is going to be a big, big deal next year? Hell yes, I do, including broadband. But, and actually with coronavirus, of course, broadband, to the extent that there were people that sort of didn't get the importance of building out broadband, they get it now. I mean, if anybody was slow and didn't figure out before the coronavirus, I think they figured it out now.
Charlie, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you very much personally and for our organization. Let me turn it back to our CEO, Rick Kapler.
Hey, thank you, Dick. Thanks for leading that great Q&A session there. And Charlie, thank you for a fascinating presentation. And we get insights from you that we just don't get from anybody else. And we sure appreciate you being here today and sharing your time and expertise with us. Thank you very, very much. I want to thank all our sponsors once again. And thanks to Arlen Communications and LG Electronics. And remember our Free Speech America Gala on October 14th. And we'll see you back here in late October for another virtual communications forum luncheon. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you to our special guest speaker today. Thank you to the Navy Band. And thank you again to our sponsors. See you next month.